Melissa Hart was found lifeless in a shopping cart behind an abandoned strip mall, but her story began long before that discovery. Ryan Blake, her hot-tempered boyfriend with a violent past, and Harold Benton, an older diner customer with an unsettling obsession, both hovered over her life in the weeks before her death. When police uncovered her bruised body, 8 months pregnant and bound with strips of cloth, investigators realized they weren't chasing a single suspect. They were unraveling a nightmare of control, jealousy, and betrayal that would expose not one monster but two. The morning was gray and bitter, the kind of Iowa morning when the wind cuts through layers of clothing and everything feels still. At the edge of an abandoned strip mall on the south side of Des Moines, a security guard walked his usual patrol. The buildings had been empty for years, their windows boarded and their signs long faded. Nothing much ever happened here. The only movement came from stray animals or the occasional group of teenagers daring each other to sneak around the deserted parking lot. But this morning, something was different. Near the dumpsters, shoved against a wall of cracked concrete, sat a shopping cart that didn't belong. At first glance, it looked like the usual junk that gathered around forgotten corners of the city. Torn blankets spilled over the sides, and a dark coat hung limply over the metal frame. The guard thought it was just a homeless person's makeshift bed and almost walked past. But something about the stillness of the cart caught his eye. The way the blankets were layered didn't look accidental. They seemed arranged to hide rather than cover. He stepped closer, and the smell reached him before his hand did. A heavy, sour odor that made his stomach turn. He pulled back the top blanket, and what he saw underneath made his heart race. Inside the cart was the body of a young woman. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly parted as if she had been frozen mid-breath. Bruises marked her face, and her hands were bound tightly with a strip of fabric torn from what looked like a bedsheet. She wore a maternity dress stretched tightly across her stomach, swollen with pregnancy. The sight was so horrifying that for a moment the guard could not process what he was looking at. He staggered back, fumbled for his phone, and called the police. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived. Officers surrounded the scene, their voices low but tense, each one trying to take in the grim discovery. The body was carefully examined where it lay in the cart, the evidence photographed from every angle. A blanket was pulled back farther, revealing more bruises across her arms and legs. She had clearly suffered before her death. The most haunting detail, though, was her pregnancy. Even hardened officers who had seen countless crime scenes stood in stunned silence. The image of a young mother-to-be, discarded in a cart like trash, was almost too much to comprehend. The parking lot was quickly taped off, and detectives began their work. Neighbors and shop owners from nearby blocks gathered at the edge of the police line, whispering in disbelief. Who was she? How long had she been there? Why would someone abandon her like this? No one seemed to recognize her at first glance, and the fact that the cart had been pushed behind dumpsters meant whoever left her wanted her hidden. Yet not hidden well enough. The discovery was accidental, but it was also inevitable. The shopping cart had been left where the cold morning light would eventually reveal its grim secret, and the investigation that followed would uncover far more darkness than anyone expected. The woman in the cart was soon identified as 27-year-old Melissa Hart. For the detectives piecing her life together, the first clues came from fingerprints and a missing persons report filed nearly 2 weeks earlier by a concerned co-worker at the diner where she worked. Melissa had been a waitress at a small roadside restaurant, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and pie. Everyone who knew her described her as quiet but kind, someone who kept her troubles private yet always smiled when she carried a tray to a table. Beneath that smile, however, her life had been unraveling in ways that few had noticed until it was too late. Melissa had moved to Iowa 3 years earlier from a small town in Nebraska. She had no close family in the state, no siblings or parents nearby to lean on. The pregnancy was supposed to be a new beginning for her. Co-workers remembered how she sometimes rubbed her belly while waiting for orders, whispering to herself as if speaking to the baby. She had told them she wanted to give her child a life better than her own, one filled with stability and safety. Yet the way she lived suggested constant struggle. Her apartment was sparsely furnished, and she often picked up extra shifts to cover bills. Despite her efforts, she seemed to be saving money for something more than just rent. Phone records gave investigators their first look into Melissa's private world. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, her text messages became more frantic. She wrote about being afraid, about wanting to leave someone. She never named the person directly, but the tone of her messages hinted at threats, pressure, and control. Friends at the diner remembered that she had recently mentioned wanting to start fresh in another town. She even confided to one cook that she was saving money for a bus ticket, though she didn't say where she was going. The pregnancy made her story even more complex. Medical records showed she was 8 months along, nearly ready to give birth. No father's name had been listed on the hospital forms. This omission left investigators questioning who was truly connected to her and whether the child she carried was part of the reason her life ended in violence. The idea that someone might harm her because of the baby added another layer of darkness to an already disturbing case. Detectives retraced her final days through surveillance footage and financial records. The last confirmed sighting of Melissa was outside her apartment complex, where a neighbor remembered seeing her walking toward a waiting car late one evening. She carried a small bag and looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. The neighbor thought nothing of it at the time, but the detail now loomed large. Whoever picked her up that night might have been the last person to see her alive. Her absence had been noticed at the diner after only a day. She never missed work without calling. Her co-worker's missing persons report had sparked a brief investigation, but with little evidence of foul play at the time, the case went cold until the horrifying discovery at the strip mall. Now, Melissa's quiet life, one of long shifts, whispered hopes, and hidden fears, was laid bare. What at first seemed like an ordinary disappearance had revealed a young woman trapped in a web of secrets, and detectives knew they would need to untangle those threads to find the truth behind her final moments. As investigators delved deeper into Melissa's past, the shadows around her life began to lengthen. What had seemed like the story of a young woman trying to raise a child on her own grew more complicated with every lead uncovered. The first major thread pointed directly to her boyfriend, a 32-year-old mechanic named Ryan Blake. Ryan was known around town for his temper. Police reports revealed a trail of domestic calls made by neighbors who had heard shouting and crashes from his garage apartment. Though Melissa had never pressed charges, witnesses described her leaving his place on more than one occasion with tears in her eyes and bruises on her arms. To many in her circle, it was no secret that Ryan had a grip on her life, one that she seemed too afraid to break. But Ryan was not the only figure looming over Melissa's final months. Investigators discovered another name that surfaced again and again, an older man in his 50s named Harold Benton. Harold had been a regular customer at the diner where Melissa worked, a quiet man with money to spend and an unsettling interest in the young waitress. He often lingered after meals, leaving unusually large tips, gifts, and handwritten notes folded into napkins. Employees recalled how Melissa tried to be polite but would grow tense whenever Harold walked through the door. To her co-workers, he seemed infatuated. To detectives, he became a second potential suspect. The overlap between the two men raised difficult questions. Melissa's phone records revealed calls and texts from both Ryan and Harold in the days before she vanished. Some of the messages from Ryan were threatening, full of demands about where she was and who she was talking to. Harold's messages, in contrast, were suffocatingly sweet, promising her a better life if she would just trust him. The dual pressure of an abusive boyfriend and a man who wouldn't leave her alone painted a picture of someone trapped with no safe path forward. Neighbors provided more unsettling details. A woman who lived in the same apartment building as Melissa remembered hearing raised voices late one night. She couldn't make out all the words, but she recalled Melissa crying, begging someone to leave her alone. Another resident claimed to have seen Ryan's truck parked outside the building more often than usual, sometimes idling with the headlights off. Yet a diner regular swore he saw Harold waiting across the street from Melissa's workplace in his car, as if watching for her to come outside. Both men seemed to be circling her life in increasingly intrusive ways. Detectives began to theorize that Melissa might have been planning to escape not just Ryan but also Harold. The idea of starting fresh somewhere else suddenly took on new meaning. Perhaps she wasn't running from one man but from two. Her savings for a bus ticket and her secrecy about her plans suggested she knew danger was closing in. It was possible she had tried to confide in someone, but if she had, no one stepped forward. The silence around her final days grew heavier the more investigators uncovered. The grim possibility soon took shape that Melissa had been caught in the crossfire between two men, one violent, the other obsessive, both unwilling to let her go. The discovery of her body in such a public, degrading place seemed less like a random act and more like the result of someone desperate to assert control even in death. With two strong suspects and no clear proof against either, detectives faced the terrifying reality that the truth about Melissa's final night might be buried under layers of manipulation, rage, and obsession. When detectives shifted their focus from Melissa's relationships to the evidence left behind, the story grew even darker. Ryan, the mechanic boyfriend, became their first target. A warrant for his garage turned up disturbing details. In a corner of the oil-stained floor, investigators found faint traces of blood. At first, it was too little to test, but luminol revealed splatters that had been wiped down in a rush. Alongside the stains sat a rag soaked in bleach, discarded carelessly in a trash bin. While the cleanup attempt was clumsy, it was enough to suggest something violent had taken place there. Yet the garage wasn't the only lead. A review of traffic cameras placed Harold, the older diner patron, circling the strip mall on the very night Melissa disappeared. The footage showed his sedan passing the location at least 3 times, each lap slower than the last. He never stopped on camera, but his presence so close to the site where her body was later found made investigators uneasy. When questioned, Harold insisted he had been running errands, though he failed to provide receipts or any proof to support his story. His evasiveness raised suspicions that he knew more than he was willing to admit. The most chilling discovery came from Melissa's cell phone data. On the night she vanished, she received calls from both men. Ryan's number appeared first, his calls growing more frequent and aggressive. Less than an hour later, Harold's number followed. The overlap painted a grim picture. Both men had been vying for her attention within the narrow window when she was last seen alive. Detectives theorized that she may have arranged to meet one of them, only to be intercepted by the other. Witness accounts added more fuel to the theory. A clerk at a nearby gas station remembered seeing Melissa late that evening. She looked distressed, clutching her phone and pacing near the pumps. Not long after, a truck resembling Ryan's pulled into the lot, but the clerk couldn't be certain. Minutes later, a sedan matching Harold's description was spotted heading in the same direction. The overlapping trails of both vehicles created the sense of a chase, though no one could determine exactly who reached her first. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to separate fact from coincidence. The blood at Ryan's garage was tested, but the degraded sample delayed results. Meanwhile, surveillance of Harold's home uncovered that he had scrubbed his car interior spotless just days after Melissa's disappearance. Investigators found fibers that could have matched the blanket she was discovered with, though the lab results remained inconclusive. Each piece of evidence pointed in conflicting directions, as if both men had played some role. Detectives began to consider the unthinkable possibility that Melissa had fallen victim to more than one predator. The evidence suggested she may have first encountered Ryan, whose violence had left her injured, only for Harold to enter the picture later. Whether he helped cover up the crime or had been directly involved in transporting her body to the shopping cart, his actions showed he was not innocent. The twisted overlap of their involvement revealed a terrifying reality. Melissa had been trapped between two men, each obsessed with owning her and neither willing to let her live free. The web of lies and half-truths made the investigation feel less like a hunt for a single killer and more like unraveling a conspiracy born from jealousy, control, and fear. The final break in the case came through science. After weeks of waiting, the lab results from the blood found in Ryan's garage returned. It was a match to Melissa. The traces were small but undeniable, proof that she had been there on the night of her disappearance. With this evidence in hand, detectives confronted Ryan. Under the weight of questioning, his tough demeanor began to crumble. He eventually admitted to striking Melissa during an argument. He claimed she had threatened to leave him, and in his rage, he lashed out. According to his story, the blow was unintentional, but when she collapsed, he panicked. He tied her hands, trying to control the situation, and when she stopped moving, he realized she was gone. What he said next, however, complicated the case even further. Ryan insisted he had not been the one to abandon Melissa in the shopping cart. He claimed Harold appeared at the garage after the argument, demanding to know where she was. Ryan told detectives that Harold offered to take care of things if Ryan stayed quiet. Terrified and desperate to avoid prison, Ryan agreed. He swore that Harold loaded Melissa's body into his own vehicle and disappeared into the night. At first, investigators were skeptical. It sounded like an easy way to shift blame, but Ryan's story gained traction when additional evidence surfaced. Fibers from the blanket covering Melissa were conclusively linked to Harold's car. A closer examination revealed traces of dirt and rust matching the dumpsters behind the strip mall. Detectives realized Harold had indeed been at the scene. When confronted with the findings, Harold cracked under pressure. His confession painted him not as the killer, but as an accomplice with his own twisted motives. He admitted he had known about Ryan's violence and believed Melissa would eventually leave him. But when Ryan called in a panic, Harold saw an opportunity. By disposing of her body, he thought he could hide his own involvement with her while ensuring Ryan carried the weight of suspicion. The truth was as disturbing as it was tangled. Melissa's death came at the hands of Ryan's temper, but her body's final resting place was chosen by Harold. Together, their actions revealed two different brands of cruelty, one born from rage, the other from obsession and selfishness. Neither man had cared about Melissa's life beyond what she represented to them. To Ryan, she was someone to control. To Harold, she was an object of fixation. In the end, they both ensured she would never escape. The case closed with Ryan convicted of murder and Harold charged as an accessory. Yet the resolution brought little comfort to those who had known Melissa. The image of her body in a shopping cart lingered like a scar on the community, a symbol of how deeply she had been failed. The young woman who once whispered to her unborn child about a better future had been silenced by two men who saw her only as a possession. Even in justice, there was no undoing the horror of her final days, nor the haunting legacy left behind in that desolate strip mall.